There is a number that quietly divides the financial world into two very different experiences, and most people will spend their entire lives on the wrong side of it without ever understanding why. That number is $100,000. Not because of what it buys, not because of what it represents symbolically, but because of what it does, mathematically, psychologically, and systemically, once it exists in a single place, working continuously without you touching it. Most people encounter money as a flow. It arrives, usually in the form of a paycheck, and it leaves, usually faster than it arrived. Rent, groceries, transportation, subscriptions, debt payments. The modern financial life is structured almost entirely around managing outflows, and for the majority of people, that management consumes nearly all of their mental and emotional energy around money. The paycheck arrives, and within days or weeks, it has been distributed across obligations, leaving behind a small remainder that feels more like a buffer against disaster than a foundation for anything else. This is the financial experience of most adults in developed economies, and it is so normal, so universal, that it rarely gets questioned. But underneath this experience of constant flow, there is a separate system operating, one that most people can observe from a distance but never quite enter. It is the system where money generates more money, where assets produce income, where time works in your favor rather than against you. And the entry point into that system, the minimum threshold where its effects become mathematically meaningful in a human lifetime, is approximately $100,000. To understand why this number matters, you have to understand what money actually does when it sits in a productive asset, at a modest and historically reasonable return of 7% annually, the kind of long-run average associated with broad market index funds. $100,000 generates approximately $7,000 per year without any additional contribution. That is roughly $580 per month, appearing not from labor, but from the simple existence of the capital. At $50,000, that same 7% produces only $3,500 annually. Meaningful, but not yet crossing the psychological or practical threshold where it begins to reshape your decisions. But at $100,000, something shifts. The returns become visible. They become audible. They start to feel like a second income rather than a rounding error. This is what economists sometimes call the compounding inflection point. Not the moment when compounding begins, because compounding begins from the very first dollar, but the moment when compounding becomes perceptible enough to change how a person thinks about their financial decisions. Below this threshold, most people are psychologically still in the flow model, still thinking about money as something that arrives and departs. Above it, a slow but fundamental cognitive shift begins. The capital starts to feel like an entity in its own right, something that has behavior and momentum, something that needs to be managed rather than spent. The psychological dimension of this threshold is as significant as the mathematical one, and it is far less discussed. There is a well-documented phenomenon in behavioral economics, sometimes called the scarcity mindset, a cognitive mode that activates when resources feel insufficient, and that measurably impairs financial decision-making. When people feel financially precarious, the research consistently shows they become more focused on immediate needs, less able to think about long-term consequences, and more susceptible to high-cost financial products like payday loans, revolving credit card debt, and rent-to-own arrangements that extract value rather than build it. The scarcity mindset is not a character flaw. It is an entirely rational cognitive response to genuine precariousness, and it creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the conditions that make good financial decisions hardest are also the conditions most likely to persist without a significant change in material circumstances. Crossing the $100,000 threshold does not eliminate financial stress overnight, but it begins to dissolve the scarcity mindset in ways that compound over time. A person with $100,000 in a stable account thinks about a job differently than someone without it. They negotiate differently, they tolerate risk differently, they make purchasing decisions differently. The capital creates a psychological floor that changes behavior in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to observe. The wealthy often describe this as having options. What they are really describing is the cognitive experience of operating outside the scarcity mindset, of being able to consider choices rather than simply react to circumstances. There is also a systemic dimension to this threshold that rarely gets discussed in mainstream financial content, and it is perhaps the most important of the three. The financial system, meaning banks, lending institutions, investment platforms, tax structures, and even employment markets, is not neutral. It does not treat all participants equally, and it is not designed to. It is structured in ways that consistently reward the presence of capital and penalize its absence. A person with $100,000 in assets can access borrowing rates that someone without assets cannot. They qualify for investment vehicles, certain index funds, real estate instruments, tax advantage structures that have minimum thresholds explicitly designed to exclude smaller participants. They receive, in many jurisdictions, tax treatment on capital gains that is more favorable than the treatment applied to ordinary income from labor. None of this is hidden. All of it is legal. But the cumulative effect is that the financial system functions as an accelerant for those who have already reached a certain threshold of capital and as a brake for those who have not. This is not a conspiracy. It is an emergent property of how financial systems evolve over time. They optimize for the behavior of the participants with the most capital because those participants generate the most activity, the most fees, and the most influence over regulatory structures. The result is a system that is genuinely difficult to navigate from the bottom, not because of any single rule or policy, but because of the cumulative weight of 1,000 small asymmetries, each one individually defensible, but collectively constituting a significant structural advantage for those above the threshold. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires clarity. Because the practical implication is straightforward. The first $100,000 is not just numerically significant. It is the threshold at which the mathematics, the psychology, and the system all begin to work in the same direction simultaneously. Below it, you're often fighting against all three. Above it, all three begin, slowly and imperfectly, to work with you. This is why people who have crossed this threshold often describe the journey to the first 100,000 as the hardest part, harder than the journey from 100,000 to 500,000, harder in many ways than any subsequent accumulation. It is not because the behavior required changes dramatically. Saving, investing consistently, avoiding high-cost debt, staying in the market during downturns, these behaviors remain constant. But below the threshold, those behaviors produce results that are hard to feel. The compounding is real, but invisible. The psychological rewards are minimal. The system offers little reinforcement. And the scarcity mindset, if present, works actively against consistency. The first 100,000 requires the most discipline for the least immediate feedback, which is precisely why it functions as such an effective filter. What changes on the other side is not the rules. The rules are the same. What changes is the experience of following them. The returns become visible. The options become real. The cognitive weight of financial precariousness begins to lift, incrementally and unevenly, but genuinely. And the system, imperfect, asymmetric, and indifferent to individual circumstances, begins to function more like a tailwind than a headwind. None of this means that reaching $100,000 is sufficient, or that it guarantees any particular outcome. or that the path is equally accessible to everyone starting from every position. It is not. Starting income, cost of living, family obligations, health, access to education, all of these shape the timeline significantly. And for many people, the timeline is genuinely long. But understanding that the threshold exists, understanding what it does and why, changes the nature of the effort. It transforms an abstract goal into a specific mechanical target. It reframes the question from, "How do I get rich?" which has no clean answer, to, "How do I accumulate $100,000 in a productive asset?" which does. The financial world has two modes. In one, money is always leaving. In the other, money is always arriving. The distance between those two modes is not infinite. It is not reserved for the already wealthy or the extraordinarily talented. It is a threshold, mathematical, psychological, and systemic. And it has a number. That number, for most people in most circumstances, is approximately $100,000. Not the end of the journey, not a guarantee of anything, but the point at which the journey begins to feel, for the first time, like it might actually be going somewhere.